The first encounter. It was a sweltering afternoon in Pinewood City, the kind of heat that seemed to rise from the pavement and blur the edges of the towering buildings downtown. Captain Angela Pierce stepped out of her black sedan, its sleek form reflecting the sun's harsh glare. Angela adjusted her police captain badge, her uniform pristine, as she scanned the streets. Pinewood was her city, and she dedicated over a decade to protecting it, earning respect from officers and civilians alike. Standing tall at 5'11", with her brown skin glowing in the daylight, Angela Pierce was not someone you'd easily overlook. Her reputation preceded her. She was known for both her tactical brilliance and her unwavering sense of justice. In her late 30s, she had risen through the ranks, breaking barriers as one of the youngest black female captains in the force. Today, though, her mind wasn't on work. She had just wrapped up a grueling meeting and wanted to grab something light before returning to the precinct. The corner store wasn't anything fancy, a small family-owned business nestled between a laundromat and a barber shop. Angela had frequented it for years, often engaging in quick conversations with the elderly cashier, Mrs. Jordan, who was always full of local gossip. As she stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed, and a familiar warmth greeted her. Captain Pierce. Mrs. Jordan's voice rang out from behind the counter, her smile as bright as always. "Good to see you, dear. How's the force treating you today?" Angela chuckled, picking up a bottle of water and a snack from the shelves. Same old, Mrs. Jordan. Just trying to keep the city in one piece." But as Angela made her way to the register, a cold presence swept into the store behind her. She didn't need to look back to feel it, the kind of sensation that put her instincts on alert. She could sense the shift in the room, and it wasn't long before she realized why. A white officer in a crisp uniform stood by the entrance, his stance rigid, arms crossed over his chest. He was watching her with an intensity that set her nerves on edge. She had seen his type before, arrogant, quick to judge, the kind who saw a person's skin color before they saw the badge. His eyes followed her every move as if waiting for her to do something wrong. Angela kept her face neutral, reminding herself of her position. She approached the counter, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Jordan as she placed her items down. The cashier was oblivious to the tension that was now thick in the air, her focus entirely on Angela. Just as Mrs. Jordan handed back Angela's change, the officer behind her spoke. His voice was sharp, like a blade cutting through the peaceful atmosphere of the small store. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID." Angela turned slowly, her heart sinking. This wasn't the first time she had been stopped without reason, but it always stung. She locked eyes with the officer, keeping her expression steady. "Excuse me," she replied calmly. The officer took a step forward, his hand casually resting on his holstered gun. "You heard me. I saw you acting suspiciously in the store. I need to see your identification." Angela's eyebrows furrowed, disbelief washing over her. Acting suspiciously. She had done nothing but pick up a bottle of water and a granola bar. There was no mistaking the intent behind his words. She could feel the heat of his gaze on her, full of assumptions and prejudice. "I'm Captain Angela Pierce of the Pinewood City Police Department," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I don't need to show you my ID unless you have a legitimate reason to ask for it." The officer's face darkened, his jaw clenched. "I saw you handling merchandise like you were going to steal something. I'm asking you again. Let me see your ID." Angela's patience was wearing thin. Years of facing these microaggressions had taught her how to keep her composure, but this situation was different. This wasn't just about her being treated unfairly. This was an outright challenge to her authority, to her very identity as a police officer. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her voice cold but controlled. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I've been in this store countless times. I'm not a thief. If you have any doubts, you can contact my precinct, and they'll confirm who I am." But her words only seemed to fuel his arrogance. The officer's smirk grew wider, and he took out a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Oh, I know exactly who you are," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "And today, you're under arrest for suspected theft. Turn around." Angela froze. The reality of what was happening hit her like a truck. She had seen officers abuse their power before, but never had she imagined that she would be on the receiving end of such blatant injustice. Her blood boiled, every fiber in her body wanting to lash out. But she knew better. She knew how quickly things could escalate. Her heart pounded as she turned her back to the officer, slowly raising her hands. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, their cold steel biting into her skin. She stood there, her breath shallow, the weight of humiliation heavy on her shoulders. The small store had gone deathly quiet. Mrs. Jordan looked horrified, frozen in place behind the counter. A few customers stood in stunned silence, their phones out, capturing the surreal scene. But as the officer shoved her towards the exit, Angela's mind raced. She knew this was far from over. She had to stay calm, stay focused. This was a battle she didn't choose, but it was one she wasn't about to lose. The breaking point. The backseat of Officer Rick Stevens' squad car was cramped, suffocating. The air was thick, the lingering scent of stale sweat making it hard for Angela to breathe as she sat rigidly, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Outside the windows, curious bystanders were gathering, some filming with their phones, others whispering in disbelief. Angela tried to focus her breathing, the heat from the squad car and the sting of the handcuffs intensifying the humiliation she felt. She had been through challenges before. Being one of the few black women in law enforcement had presented obstacles at every turn. But this felt different, more personal. She wasn't just being arrested. She was being publicly stripped of her dignity, her years of service, and her hard-earned respect. Angela's mind raced as she watched Officer Stevens stride towards the front of the car, his posture oozing arrogance. He tapped on his radio, nonchalantly relaying the arrested dispatch as if it were a routine traffic stop. "This is Officer Stevens, badge 4396. I have a female suspect in custody. Black, mid-30s, identified as Captain Angela Pierce of Pinewood PD." His voice crackled over the radio. "Suspected theft, over." Suspected theft. The words echoed in Angela's mind, each syllable a fresh wound. She clenched her fists behind her back, the cuffs digging painfully into her wrists. The absurdity of it all, accused of stealing a granola bar and a bottle of water, made her want to scream. But she knew better. Losing her temper wouldn't help. It would only fuel Officer Stevens' narrative. Instead, she took a deep breath, summoning the calmness that had gotten her through years of facing prejudice and adversity. She watched as Stevens strutted back towards the car, his smirk ever present. He opened the driver's door and slid into the seat, glancing at Angela through the rearview mirror with that same condescending look. The engine roared to life, and the car jerked forward, pulling away from the corner store. "Hope you're comfortable back there, Captain," he sneered, placing heavy emphasis on her title. "You won't be needing that badge where you're going." Angela said nothing, refusing to engage with his baiting. Her eyes locked onto the rearview mirror, catching his smug expression, but she remained silent. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his words cut. She knew her rights. She knew her record was spotless, and she knew this arrest would never hold up once her precinct found out. But that wasn't the point, was it? Stevens wasn't interested in justice or the law. He was interested in power, specifically in using that power to degrade and dehumanize someone he saw as beneath him. And Angela knew exactly why. As they cruised down the main avenue, Angela could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her shoulders. It wasn't just about her now. It was about everyone who had ever faced this kind of unjust treatment, about the countless names and stories that went unheard. She had a duty to not only stand up for herself, but for them as well. Stevens took a sharp turn, the car jolting Angela sideways. She winced, trying to adjust her position without drawing attention to her discomfort. Outside, the familiar skyline of Pinewood City blurred past, but Angela's thoughts were miles away. She had been in this city long enough to know the reputation of officers like Stevens. He wasn't just some rookie on a power trip. He was known for his aggressive, often racially charged behavior. He had slipped through the cracks of accountability more times than she cared to count. Complaints had been filed against him, but they always seemed to disappear, swept under the rug by those in power. Today, though, he had crossed a line, and Angela was determined to make sure there would be no sweeping this under the rug. The squad car pulled up to the entrance of the precinct, and Angela's pulse quickened. A crowd had already gathered outside. Civilians, officers, even reporters, all drawn to the spectacle of a police captain in handcuffs. As Stevens opened the door and yanked her out, the flash of cameras greeted her like a blinding spotlight. It was a scene she had witnessed countless times from the other side, but now she was the headline. Stevens guided her roughly towards the station, his hand clamped around her arm as if she were a dangerous criminal. Angela felt the eyes of the crowd burning into her, judging her, questioning her. She had spent years building a reputation of integrity and leadership, but in a matter of minutes, this man had reduced her to a spectacle. As they approached the entrance, a familiar face emerged from the crowd. Lieutenant James Daniels, her longtime colleague and friend. His face was a mixture of disbelief and fury as he pushed through the throng of onlookers. "Stevens," Daniels barked, rushing forward. "What the hell is going on here?" Stevens barely spared him a glance. "Caught your captain in the act of stealing. Taking her in for processing," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Daniel's eyes darted to Angela, who stood tall despite the handcuffs. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes steely. He had never seen her look so calm in the face of such blatant injustice. "Are you out of your mind?" Daniels hissed, stepping between Angela and Stevens. "This is Captain Pierce. She's one of us. What kind of joke is this?" Stevens sneered, his grip tightening on Angela's arm. "No joke, Lieutenant. Just doing my job." "Your job?" Daniel's voice rose in disbelief. "Your job is to protect and serve, not humiliate one of your own based on nothing more than your warped assumptions." By now, the crowd had grown, murmurs of confusion and outrage spreading like wildfire. Reporters had their microphones ready, eager to pounce on the unfolding drama. Stevens, however, was undeterred. He straightened his posture, his expression one of defiance. "She was acting suspiciously in the store," Stevens retorted, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Handling merchandise like she was going to steal it. I had probable cause." Daniel's face flushed with anger. "Probable cause? She's a police captain, for crying out loud. You really think she's going to steal a granola bar and a bottle of water?" Angela finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Lieutenant Daniels, let him finish. Let him dig his own grave." Her words were measured, controlled, but they carried the weight of someone who had already won the fight before it had even begun. Stevens' smirk faltered, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Angela saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Daniels turned to Angela, his expression softening. "I'll get this sorted, Captain. You won't have to deal with this much longer." But Angela knew better. This wasn't just about her, or about clearing her name. This was about exposing a deeper issue, an issue that ran through the veins of law enforcement like a sickness. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," she said, locking eyes with Stevens. "But this isn't just about me anymore. This is about every person who's ever been humiliated, arrested, or mistreated because of the color of their skin." The crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. Angela felt the weight of their gaze, but also their support. This wasn't just a personal battle now. It was a reckoning. The reckoning begins. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was electric. News had already begun to spread about Captain Angela Pierce's arrest, and officers gathered in hushed groups, whispering in disbelief. Some glanced in her direction with pity, others with confusion. Angela walked with her head held high, the weight of the handcuffs still biting into her wrists, but she refused to show any sign of defeat. She was determined not to let Officer Stevens, or anyone else for that matter, see her break. Officer Stevens led her down the hallway, his smirk still plastered on his face. He was basking in the attention, relishing the moment. To him, this was a triumph, proof that he could take down someone as high-ranking as Angela Pierce. But deep down, Angela knew the tide was about to turn, and when it did, Stevens wouldn't be ready for what was coming. As they reached the processing room, the tension was palpable. Lieutenant Daniels had followed closely behind them, his face still contorted with anger. He had made several calls on the way over, and Angela could tell that the cavalry was on its way. "Stevens, this is going too far," Daniels growled, stepping forward to block the entrance to the holding area. "You have no grounds to arrest Captain Pierce, and you damn well know it. She hasn't committed any crime. You're making a mistake." Stevens puffed out his chest, his hand hovering near his gun, as if to remind everyone of his authority. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, I'm just following protocol. She was acting suspiciously, and I had probable cause to arrest her. If she's innocent, she can explain herself in court." Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, a door at the end of the hallway swung open, and the heavy footsteps of someone important echoed through the narrow corridor. Angela turned to see none other than Chief Martin stepping into view. His graying hair and lined face told the story of a man who had seen it all, but today there was an unfamiliar fire in his eyes. He was not just a chief here. He was a man who had worked alongside Angela for years, someone who knew her character, her dedication, and her unwavering sense of justice. "Stevens," Chief Martin barked, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. "What the hell is going on here?" For a brief moment, Angela saw the flicker of fear in Stevens' eyes, but he quickly masked it with his usual bravado. "Chief, I know what you were just doing," Martin interrupted, his tone dangerously low. He marched forward, his eyes burning with fury, until he was standing inches away from Stevens. "You arrested one of our finest officers on a baseless charge. Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've just unleashed?" Stevens' smirk faltered, but he stood his ground. "With all due respect, Chief, I had probable cause. She was in that store, acting like..." "Probable cause?" Martin's voice rose. "Captain Pierce is one of the highest-ranking officers in this department. She has an impeccable record, and you're telling me you arrested her for suspicion of theft over a granola bar. Do you even hear yourself?" Angela stood silently, watching the scene unfold. It was surreal, watching someone like Chief Martin, who rarely lost his composure, tear into Stevens with such ferocity. But she knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about exposing the kind of systemic issues that Stevens represented. Stevens opened his mouth to speak, but the chief cut him off again. "I want you to take those handcuffs off her right now. And then you're going to sit down with Internal Affairs and explain exactly why you thought it was appropriate to arrest Captain Pierce on such a flimsy accusation." For a moment, it seemed as if Stevens might argue, but the intensity of Chief Martin's glare made him think twice. With a reluctant sigh, he stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs around Angela's wrists. The sharp clink of the metal falling away felt like a release, not just of the physical restraints, but of the oppressive weight that had been hanging over her since the arrest. Angela rubbed her sore wrists, her eyes never leaving Stevens. The man who had humiliated her in front of the entire city was now standing before her, visibly shaken. He had overplayed his hand, and now the walls were closing in. "Chief Martin," Angela said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, this isn't just about me. Officer Stevens' behavior is part of a larger problem. This kind of abuse of power happens all too often, and it's not just me who suffers because of it. We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Chief Martin's expression softened as he nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "You're right, Angela. This isn't just about today. This is about making sure we hold our officers accountable for their actions. Stevens, you're going to be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." Stevens' face drained of color. "Administrative leave? Chief, you can't be serious. I was just doing my job." "No," Martin said, his voice cold and final. "Your job is to uphold the law with integrity and respect. You failed that today, Stevens. Now, get out of my sight." Stevens hesitated for a moment, his hands clenching into fists, before turning on his heel and storming down the hallway. The tension in the air seemed to lift slightly as he disappeared around the corner, but Angela knew that this was far from over. There was still work to be done. Later that evening, Angela sat in the familiar comfort of her office at the precinct. The day's events played over and over in her mind, but she wasn't angry anymore. She was focused. The arrest had been a wake-up call, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed the blatant injustice she had faced. And now, it was time to do something about it. A knock on the door brought her out of her thoughts, and she looked up to see Lieutenant Daniel standing in the doorway, a sympathetic smile on his face. "Hey," he said softly, stepping inside. "How are you holding up?" Angela smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm all right. Just processing everything." Daniels nodded, pulling up a chair and sitting across from her. "Listen, Angela, what happened today was wrong, on so many levels, but you handled it with grace. And I think that's why this whole thing is going to blow up in Stevens' face. People saw what he did. They know what kind of man he is." Angela sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's not just about Stevens. This is bigger than him. There are so many others like him out there, officers who abuse their power, who see people like me and make assumptions. This is an opportunity to change things, to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen to anyone else." Daniel smiled, a glint of admiration in his eyes. "You always were the one to lead the charge. Huh. Never backing down, even when the odds are stacked against you." Angela chuckled softly. "I don't know how to be any other way." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Angela spoke again, her tone more serious. "We're going to take this all the way, James. I'm not just going to let this slide. Stevens needs to face the consequences, but more importantly, we need to make sure this department, and departments across the country, start holding people accountable." Daniels nodded firmly. "You've got my support, Angela. Whatever you need, I'm with you." Angela's gaze shifted to the window, where the city lights twinkled against the night sky. She could see the reflection of herself in the glass, a woman who had been through the fire, but who had come out stronger. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The storm erupts. The next morning, Angela Pierce woke up with a heavy heart. The events of the previous day still clung to her like an unwelcome fog, but she knew there was no time to dwell on the past. She had a battle to fight, not just for herself, but for every person who had been mistreated or profiled because of the color of their skin. As she sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Angela hesitated before unlocking it, knowing full well that the media storm had likely begun. Sure enough, headlines flooded her screen. Police captain arrested by fellow officer on baseless theft charges. Racial profiling at its worst. Officer arrests high-ranking captain over granola bar. Captain Angela Pierce speaks out. "This is about more than me." Angela closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. It had only been a matter of hours, but the story had already gained national attention. Video footage of her being handcuffed and led out of the convenience store was circulating online, and public outrage was building. Civil rights groups were calling for immediate action, and social media was ablaze with the hashtag Justice for Captain Pierce. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a call from her precinct. She braced herself and answered. Captain Pierce, the familiar voice of Chief Martin, greeted her. We've got a situation here. The media's all over this, and the mayor's office is getting involved. They want a statement from you, something to calm the storm. Angela took a deep breath. She knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about shifting the narrative. I'll come down to the station, Chief, she replied. But I'm not interested in calming anything. People need to know the truth. I figured you'd say that. Martin responded with a hint of pride. We'll be ready for you. As Angela made her way to the precinct, her mind raced with the implications of what was happening. Officer Rick Stevens had lit a match, and now the fire was spreading. She had to decide how she was going to fan the flames. When Angela arrived at the precinct, she was greeted by a sea of reporters camped outside the station. Cameras flashed in her face as microphones were thrust toward her, reporters shouting questions all at once. Captain Pierce, how are you responding to the arrest? Do you believe this was a case of racial profiling? Is Officer Stevens facing suspension? Angela kept her head down, ignoring the chaos as she made her way inside. The moment she entered the precinct, her fellow officers went silent, all eyes turning to her. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with unease, but all of them were waiting for what would happen next. Lieutenant Daniels met her in the lobby, his expression grim. You ready for this? He asked quietly. Angela nodded, her resolve hardening. More than ready. Together, they walked toward the conference room, where Chief Martin and a handful of senior officers had gathered to discuss the situation. As Angela entered the room, the tension was palpable. Chief Martin stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration. Angela, he greeted her, nodding solemnly. We need to address the media. The mayor's office is worried about the backlash, and they want you to help control the narrative. Angela narrowed her eyes, her jaw tightening. Control the narrative, she echoed. This isn't about controlling the story, Chief. This is about accountability. Officer Stevens needs to answer for what he did, and the people deserve to know that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated by anyone. Chief Martin sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. I know, Angela, but this is bigger than just one officer. The entire department's reputation is at stake. If we're not careful, this could spiral out of control. Angela crossed her arms, standing firm. It's already out of control, Chief. The moment Stevens decided to handcuff me in that store, the moment he decided that my skin color made me a suspect, that's when this got out of control. And if we try to sweep this under the rug, we'll only make things worse. Lieutenant Daniels nodded in agreement. Angela's right. If we don't address this head-on, the public will lose faith in us. We need to show them that we're willing to clean house when something like this happens. Chief Martin hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll hold a press conference. Angela, you'll speak, but I'll be standing by to support you. We need to send a message that the department is taking this seriously. Angela agreed, though she knew this was only the first step. The real challenge would come with the internal investigation. Officer Stevens had already been placed on administrative leave, but that wasn't enough. Angela wanted to see him held accountable, not just for what he had done to her, but for the pattern of behavior he had exhibited over the years. Later that afternoon, the press conference was held outside the precinct. A podium had been set up, and a large crowd had gathered, the media pressing forward eagerly. Angela stood beside Chief Martin, her heart pounding in her chest as the cameras focused on her. Chief Martin stepped up first, addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. We understand the concerns that have arisen following the recent arrest of Captain Angela Pierce. I want to assure you that the department is taking this matter very seriously. Officer Stevens has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." The crowd murmured in response, but their attention was fixed on Angela. They weren't here for platitudes. They were here for her. When Martin stepped aside, Angela took a deep breath and approached the podium. The sea of faces staring back at her was daunting, but she pushed her nerves aside. She had a responsibility, not just to herself, but to every person who had ever been unjustly treated by those in power. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves swirling in her stomach. "Yesterday, I was arrested by Officer Rick Stevens under suspicion of theft. As many of you know, I am a captain in the Pinewood City Police Department. I have dedicated my life to upholding the law and protecting the citizens of this city." She paused, letting her words sink in. What happened to me yesterday wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It wasn't just about a mistake. It was about a systemic issue, a culture within law enforcement that allows officers like Rick Stevens to abuse their power, to make decisions based on prejudice rather than facts. Angela glanced around the crowd, feeling the weight of the moment. I was arrested because of the color of my skin. I was humiliated, handcuffed, and treated like a criminal, despite having done nothing wrong. And I'm not the first person this has happened to. But I am in a position to speak out, and I intend to use that position to make sure this never happens again. The crowd erupted into applause, and Angela could see the reporters leaning forward, hanging on her every word. "We're calling for a full investigation into Officer Stevens' actions, and we will not rest until justice is served. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about ensuring that our police force is held to the highest standards of integrity and fairness. It's about making sure that no one, regardless of their rank, race, or background, has to experience what I went through." When Angela stepped back from the podium, the crowd's cheers grew louder. She felt a surge of emotion, knowing that this was only the beginning of the fight. But she wasn't alone anymore. The public was behind her, and together, they were going to demand the change that was long overdue. As the press conference wrapped up, Angela felt a wave of relief wash over her, but there was still much work to be done. Behind the scenes, the internal investigation was already underway, and rumors were swirling that more officers had filed complaints against Stevens for his behavior in the past. It was clear that Stevens had been operating unchecked for far too long, and now that his actions were in the spotlight, the floodgates were opening. Officers who had once been afraid to speak out were coming forward, detailing incidents of misconduct, racism, and abuse of power that had been swept under the rug for years. Angela knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was never easy, but she was ready for it. Stevens' arrest of her had triggered a chain reaction that was now impossible to stop. Karma was coming for him, and it was coming fast. The unraveling of Stevens. Days after the press conference, the precinct was buzzing with tension. The storm Angela had ignited was far from over. What had started as an internal investigation into Officer Rick Stevens had ballooned into something much larger, an inquiry into systemic misconduct and abuse of power within the department. Angela knew that this was no longer just about clearing her own name. It was about exposing the rot that had allowed officers like Stevens to flourish unchecked for years. As she arrived at the precinct that morning, Angela could sense the eyes of her colleagues following her every move. Some officers nodded in solidarity, offering her quiet support, while others glanced away, unsure of what to say. Stevens had his supporters too, officers who shared his rigid views on authority and race. But Angela had the truth on her side, and that truth was beginning to come to light. Angela made her way through the corridors, her destination clear, the Internal Affairs Office. Lieutenant Daniels had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering testimonies and evidence, and today was the day they would finally confront Stevens with the charges that had been stacking up against him. As Angela entered the office, Daniels looked up from his desk, a folder in his hand. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Angela," he greeted her, handing her the folder. "You're going to want to see this." Angela took the folder and flipped it open, her eyes scanning the documents inside. It was worse than she had imagined. There were multiple complaints against Stevens, some dating back years. Minorities, particularly Black and Latino citizens, had reported incidents of racial profiling, harassment, and even excessive force. Many of these complaints had been dismissed or lost in the bureaucracy, buried under layers of paperwork and silence. "This is damning," Angela muttered, her stomach churning as she read through the reports. "How has this been allowed to go on for so long?" Daniels sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You know how it is. Some officers protect their own, and Stevens knew how to play the system. He's been getting away with this for years because no one was willing to stand up to him. But now, thanks to what happened to you, we've got him backed into a corner. He can't weasel his way out of this one." Angela nodded, but her mind was racing. The depth of Stevens' misconduct was staggering. He hadn't just targeted her. He had built a career out of terrorizing marginalized communities, and the system had enabled him at every turn. But now, the tide was turning, and it was time for Stevens to face the consequences. "Are we ready to confront him?" Angela asked, closing the folder and handing it back to Daniels. Daniels smiled grimly. "More than ready. Internal Affairs is calling him in for questioning today. They've got enough to recommend immediate termination and criminal charges." Angela exhaled slowly. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the scales of justice would finally tip against Stevens. But she knew this wasn't the end. Exposing Stevens was just the beginning of a much larger battle to reform the department and ensure that officers like him could no longer hide behind their badges. Later that afternoon, Angela sat in the small, sterile conference room where Stevens' questioning was to take place. The room was lit by harsh fluorescent lights, and a heavy silence hung in the air. Angela sat beside Daniels, both of them watching as Internal Affairs officers prepared the documents for Stevens' interrogation. The tension was palpable, and Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to unfold. Finally, the door swung open, and Officer Rick Stevens was led into the room. He was no longer the cocky, arrogant man who had handcuffed Angela in front of a crowd. His face was pale, his eyes wide with uncertainty. He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on Angela for a moment before quickly shifting away. He knew what was coming. Officer Stevens, one of the Internal Affairs officers, began, his voice calm but firm. "You're here today to answer questions regarding multiple complaints filed against you over the course of your career. These complaints involve allegations of racial profiling, harassment, and excessive use of force. Additionally, we will be discussing your recent arrest of Captain Angela Pierce, which has raised significant concerns about your conduct." Stevens swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice shaky but defiant. "I was just doing my job." Angela narrowed her eyes, her patience wearing thin. She had heard enough of Stevens' excuses. She had seen how men like him justify their actions, hiding behind the guise of doing their job while perpetuating injustice and abuse. But today, he wouldn't be able to hide any longer. "You call arresting a decorated captain on baseless charges doing your job?" One of the Internal Affairs officers pressed, his voice laced with incredulity. "You arrested Captain Pierce for suspicion of theft without any evidence to support your claim. You violated her rights, and in doing so, you exposed a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored." Stevens' face flushed with anger. "I had probable cause. She was acting suspiciously. How was I supposed to know who she was? Angela couldn't stay silent any longer. "It wasn't about who I was, Stevens," she said, her voice sharp. "It was about what I looked like. You saw a black woman in a store, and you assumed she was a criminal. That's not probable cause. That's racial profiling." Stevens glared at her, his jaw clenched. "You're twisting this." "No," Angela shot back, her voice rising. "I'm telling the truth, and you know it. This isn't just about me. This is about every person you've targeted, every person you've harassed because of the color of their skin. You've been abusing your power for years, and now it's all catching up to you." The room fell silent, the weight of Angela's words hanging in the air. Stevens' face was a mask of fury, but beneath it, Angela could see the fear. He knew he was cornered. There was no way out this time. The Internal Affairs officers continued their questioning, going over each of the complaints filed against Stevens. It became clear that his pattern of misconduct had been well documented, but it had been allowed to continue because of a system that protected officers like him. But now that system was crumbling, and Stevens was standing on the edge of its collapse. After what felt like hours of questioning, the lead Internal Affairs officer closed his folder and looked directly at Stevens. "Officer Stevens, based on the evidence presented today, we are recommending your immediate termination from the Pinewood City Police Department. Additionally, you will be facing criminal charges for your actions, including false arrest, harassment, and abuse of power." Stevens' face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He had lost. Angela watched as he was escorted from the room, his once proud posture now slumped in defeat. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Stevens was finally being held accountable for his actions, and it was a step toward dismantling the toxic culture that had allowed him to thrive. But Angela knew there was still much work to be done. As Angela left the precinct that evening, the weight of the day's events settled over her. Stevens was gone, but his removal was only the beginning of a long road toward reform. The media frenzy surrounding her arrest had sparked a larger conversation about racism and abuse of power in law enforcement, and now the community was demanding real change. Angela had become the face of that change, and while it was a heavy burden to carry, she was ready. The arrest, the humiliation, it had all served a purpose. It had exposed the deep flaws in the system. And now, people were listening. That evening, Angela sat on the steps of her porch, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the intensity of the day. Her phone buzzed with messages of support from colleagues, friends, and strangers who had seen her story unfold. But one message stood out, a message from a young black woman named Tasha, who had been one of the many people Stevens had harassed during his time as an officer. The message was simple, but it brought tears to Angela's eyes. "Thank you for standing up for us. You're making a difference." Angela smiled softly, wiping the tears from her cheeks. This was what it was all about. It wasn't just about taking down one bad cop. It was about lifting up an entire community, about fighting for justice for those who had been silenced for too long. And Angela Pierce wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. The ripple effect. A week had passed since Officer Rick Stevens had been escorted out of the precinct in disgrace. His termination had sent shockwaves through the department, reverberating far beyond the walls of the Pinewood City Police Station. But for Captain Angela Pierce, it wasn't the end. In many ways, it was just the beginning. Angela's decision to fight back against Stevens' abuse of power had opened a floodgate. People across the city, from marginalized communities who had long been ignored, were now speaking out. Her inbox had become a repository of stories, painful, raw testimonies from individuals who had suffered at the hands of law enforcement officers who, like Stevens, had abused their authority. Angela read every message, each one igniting a deeper resolve within her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for them too. The morning was crisp as Angela arrived at City Hall for a scheduled meeting with Mayor Thompson and a group of city officials. This was no routine meeting. It was a direct result of the pressure that had built up since Stevens' firing, a pressure that Angela had helped create. The mayor had been forced to respond to the growing outcry, and today's meeting was focused on discussing much-needed reforms within the police department. As Angela stepped out of her car, she noticed a crowd gathered outside City Hall. Protesters held signs calling for justice and change, their voices a chorus of hope and frustration. Angela smiled as she spotted familiar faces in the crowd: community leaders, activists, and even some of her fellow officers who supported her mission. The air was charged with a sense of purpose. "Captain Pierce," a voice called out. Angela turned to see a young woman approaching. Her face lit up with determination. It was Tasha, the woman who had messaged Angela after Stevens' downfall. She was one of the many people who had been harassed by Stevens, but instead of retreating into the shadows, she had decided to take a stand. "Thank you for everything you've done," Tasha said, her voice filled with emotion. "People are finally listening because of you." Angela smiled, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you for speaking out. This fight isn't over yet, but together, we're making progress." With that, Angela made her way into City Hall, where Mayor Thompson and a group of city officials were waiting in a large conference room. The atmosphere was tense, and Angela could feel the gravity of the situation as she took her seat at the table. "Captain Pierce, thank you for coming," Mayor Thompson began, his tone measured. He was a man known for his pragmatism, but today there was a hint of anxiety in his voice. The public pressure had backed him into a corner, and Angela knew he was searching for a way to balance political interests with the demands for justice. "Let's get straight to the point," Angela said, leaning forward. "The people of this city are demanding real reform. The firing of Rick Stevens was a necessary step, but it's not enough. There are systemic issues within the police department that need to be addressed, and we can't afford to ignore them any longer." The room fell silent as Angela's words hung in the air. Mayor Thompson shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking to the other officials at the table. Angela could sense the resistance building, but she was prepared. "What exactly are you proposing, Captain?" the mayor asked cautiously. Angela took a deep breath, laying out the proposals she had spent the past few days crafting with input from community leaders and legal experts. "First, we need an independent oversight committee made up of civilians to review complaints against officers. Too many cases, like those involving Stevens, have been swept under the rug. A civilian oversight committee will ensure transparency and accountability." Several officials exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by the idea. Angela pressed on. "Second, we need mandatory racial bias training for all officers, not just new recruits. This training needs to be ongoing, not a one-time box to check. Officers like Stevens were able to operate the way they did because of deep-seated biases that were never addressed." Angela's voice grew firmer as she continued. "And finally, we need to establish a zero-tolerance policy for officers who engage in racial profiling, excessive force, or abuse of power. This policy needs to come with real consequences, immediate suspension without pay, and if necessary, termination. Officers who betray the trust of the people they serve should not be allowed to remain on the force." The room remained silent for a few moments as the officials processed her words. Angela could see the discomfort in their faces. These were not easy changes to implement, and she knew they would face resistance, especially from the police union. But she also knew that the pressure from the public was too strong to ignore. Mayor Thompson finally spoke, his tone cautious but serious. "Captain Pierce, I understand the importance of what you're proposing. The events of the past few weeks have shown us that there are issues within the department that need to be addressed. But these kinds of reforms will take time. We have to consider the impact on morale within the department and the legal implications of implementing such policies." Angela's eyes narrowed. With all due respect, Mayor, the impact on morale should be the least of our concerns right now. The people of this city have lost faith in the police department because officers like Rick Stevens were allowed to operate with impunity. If we don't act now, that trust will never be restored. The mayor sighed, rubbing his temples as he considered her words. We'll need to consult with legal experts and the police union before we can move forward with any formal changes, he said finally. But I agree that we need to take action. Let's set up a task force to explore these proposals further and come up with a plan for implementation. Angela nodded, knowing that this was the best outcome she could hope for at this stage. The wheels of change were slow, but at least they were turning, and she wouldn't let them stop until real progress had been made. That evening, after the meeting, Angela found herself back at the precinct, her office bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. It had been a long day, but a productive one. She sat at her desk, her thoughts racing as she considered the path ahead. The fight for reform was far from over, but today had been a small victory. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she looked up to see Lieutenant Daniel standing in the doorway. He smiled, a tired but genuine smile, and stepped inside. "How'd it go with the mayor?" he asked, sinking into the chair across from her. Angela leaned back, crossing her arms. "Better than I expected. We're forming a task force to explore the reforms, but there's a long road ahead. The resistance is already there, and the police union won't make this easy." Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. "Nothing's ever easy when it comes to change. But you're doing something important, Angela. You're making them listen." Angela smiled softly, but her expression remained serious. "This isn't just about me, James. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I did. That no one else has to feel like they're less than, just because of the color of their skin." Daniels nodded, his face solemn. "You've got the whole city behind you, Angela. People are paying attention now. They're ready for change." Angela stared out the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The weight of her responsibility pressed against her, but it was a weight she was willing to carry. The fight for justice, for equality, for real reform, it was never easy. But it was necessary. She thought about the people who had reached out to her, the Tashas of the world who had been silenced for so long. She thought about the officers who had stood by her side, the ones who believed in the same values she did. And she thought about her future, not just as a captain in the Pinewood Police Department, but as a voice for those who had been ignored and mistreated. Angela knew the battle ahead would be tough. There would be pushback from those who feared change, those who were comfortable with the status quo. But she had come too far to back down now. The arrest, the public humiliation, the fight with Stevens, it had all led her to this moment. And she wasn't done yet. The ripple effect of her actions was spreading, reaching corners of the city and beyond that had long been left in the dark. And Angela was determined to see those ripples turn into waves of change. As she stood up from her desk, her resolve stronger than ever, Angela knew one thing for certain. Karma had caught up with Rick Stevens, but it wasn't just about Stevens anymore. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed him to thrive. And Angela Pierce was ready to lead that fight, no matter how long it took.